So, as a beginner programmer or someone that wants to set off on their journey as a programmer, I can totally understand that with the number of programming languages to consider, it's absolutely overwhelming. There's so many different types of things you can build, so many languages, and so many tech stacks for you to consider. It's absolutely a challenge to try and find the right one to get started. And a lot of people end up asking, like, should I start with one? Should I start with many? Like, how do I approach diving into this and making sure if I'm going to pick the right one, that I get the right one, and if I'm going to pick a couple, how do I make sure that they're the right ones to work together? I'm hoping that by the end of this video you feel more confident about making your choice for your first programming language and or tech stack so that you can start building things. So what we're really going to be comparing and contrasting here is, should you be focusing on one language in particular, or should you be focusing on learning a bunch of them at the same time? When I'm hearing this question, or what language should I start with, I always go back to the individual and I ask them, well, what types of things are you interested in building as a software developer? So by starting with that and trying to figure out where someone wants to focus, I really think that that's going to help narrow down where they should start. And you'll notice I'm not starting by saying, here's a list of the top most used programming languages, or the latest programming language to hit the market, or the oldest programming language that exists. I'm not focusing on that because I don't think that that's as relevant as finding something that's going to align with what you want to build as a software developer. And another primary motivator for this is your ability to focus and be engaged. So if we start by answering the question, what types of things do you want to build? That's going to help narrow down the selection of maybe where you should be starting. Okay, so let's take a couple of examples to start comparing and contrasting here so we can talk about whether or not one language makes sense or multiple at the same time. So the first example I'm going to talk about is, let's think about making a mobile application. So if someone came to me and said, hey Nick, I really want to start making mobile applications. What language should I start with? Of course, I'm going to say C#, but the right answer that I should really be telling people is, well, for what platform do you want to make a mobile application? If someone really only cared about making applications for Android devices, I might tell them you should really focus on Java development. You're going to be looking at a very different tech stack for iOS applications, and if you don't really care about ever creating applications for iOS, or if you don't care about that now, then instead of bogging you down in that type of development, I would just tell you to focus on a language that's going to align to your goals initially. Now, for those of you that are more experienced and know about different frameworks and stuff and tech stacks that allow you to develop cross-platform, you might be suggesting other things, and that's totally cool. I'm just really trying to focus on the programming language itself to start with. Otherwise, yes, I would be pushing C# again and saying something like, you should be using Maui for this, but I digress. So let's look at another example. And if you came to me and you said, hey, Nick, I really want to start making web applications. Well, there are tons of different languages that you can use for developing web applications. And if you think about the front end of a website, so the part that the user is going to be seeing and interacting with, you might be using a very different language for that versus the server side, so the back end of the website. And you might be using a very different language than the query language you'd be using for a database if you have one in your web app. So now the waters have been muddied a little bit, right? Because if we go back to the first example, I was saying, hey, look, if you're developing for a specific platform like Android, focus on Java. In this case, you said a website, and now I'm not able to sit here and say, just learn this one language, because the front end and the back end and the database might all be using something very different. But I'm going to jump in a little bit here and kind of change the context a little bit. So if you came to me and said you wanted to build a website, and we started talking about all the things that went into building a website, we might actually arrive at the fact that you putting together a whole website with all the features you're interested in, that might be a little bit too complicated to get started. And if we start to decompose that into something smaller, we might arrive at the same idea where if you're building only parts of that web application to get started, so say just the back end, you're working on a web server, or just the front end, then you're going to be looking at different languages for either of these. And that means if you're focusing on one or the other, you might be able to just focus on working in one language to start with. Now, what I don't want to suggest is that I'm telling people if you want to build a web application and you're brand new to it, you can only build the front end or the back end one at a time. I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm just saying that if you're very new to it and you want to learn about the programming and focus on a particular language, then it might be easier to just kind of pare down the problem space you're in to one or the other. Now, this is why it's not a black and white yes or no answer to this question, because I do think that if you wanted to build a web application and the entire thing was scoped down small enough, I do have a video on vertical slicing. It might be a little bit too advanced to kind of apply to this sort of introductory to programming concept we're talking about now. But if you were to think about something simple to work end to end on a website, you might be able to get away with having a little bit of exposure to something like TypeScript and JavaScript in the front end, and maybe in the back end you're using something different. You could be using Node in the back end and then still working in JavaScript, and you do have JavaScript in your front and back end of your application. So there are different ways that you could approach this. And again, I just think that if you're able to focus on fewer languages at the same time, it's going to allow you to kind of focus and build up some expertise when you're getting started. If you are finding that the concepts are kind of making sense to you pretty quickly, and it's really for you less about how you're applying your logic to the different programming languages that you're looking at, and the challenge is actually more about recalling the syntax or trying to think through the built-in libraries, then honestly, incorporating more than one programming language might be okay. And again, the entire point here is that by having fewer languages to focus on, you're kind of reducing the number of variables that you have to think about, the number of opportunities that might distract you, and you're really just allowing yourself to focus on learning and using that particular language. But again, if you're able to kind of grasp that stuff pretty quick, and you're really just trying to navigate the different things to pick from within the language and the libraries, again, using more than one could totally work, but you're going to want to feel that out for yourself, and I don't want to sit here and prescribe that to you. I'm just sharing with you some different perspectives so you can get a feel for it, and if you're trying one and it's very easy, and you're in a situation where you're building a web app and want to play around with more stuff, by all means, don't take this as a rule that you can't do more than one. And if you're in the opposite camp and you start with more than one, because you're building a front end and a back end for a website with different languages and frameworks, if that's feeling overwhelming, don't sweat it. Don't give up. You might just have a better chance at succeeding and learning quicker if you can scope down your problem to building one part at a time. And the last thing that I want to touch on here is just having realistic expectations for yourself. If you've never touched a programming language in your life and you're very new to it and you're just getting started and you really want to be able to start building things, it's okay if you're not able to right away. Try not to create an artificial pressure for yourself where, after one day you must be able to make a website. I know there's lots of stuff online that kind of sets you up this way, right? Where it might be a 1 week boot camp where after 1 week you're going to be an expert, or, do this course that you should be able to complete within a day, and you'll be able to have at scale, like cloud deployed web applications and stuff like that. Don't see these things and kind of create this pressure for yourself that you must be able to do that, and that's the norm and that's the expectation. Everyone is going to learn at their own pace. So don't get discouraged if that's not quite aligning to how you're learning. So we do want to have realistic expectations for ourselves here. I'll share with you a quick story from very early on in my programming journey, and for me, I really wanted to be able to make role-playing games with my abilities to program. This is a huge hobby of mine. I love playing role-playing games, and I figured, okay, if I can program, I can build my very own exactly how I want. But what I didn't realize right away is just how involved creating games is. And at that point in time, the only two things I could make were a console application or a WinForms application. And that meant for me that I was pretty far separated from being able to have some cool 3D game that I could walk around and cast spells and attack enemies and stuff like that. So it was going to be a lot of work to be able to get to that point. But what I discovered really on for myself is that I didn't have to go focus on the graphics and the user input and the sound and the music and the cut scenes and all the things that go into a video game, right? There are so many pieces, and I just started scoping it down and down and down into small things that I could actually work with. And the very first thing that I made was a WinForms application that had a button on it and you could attack skeletons. And that was my role-playing game. And the only way I knew how to extend it was to copy and paste code over and over again, change some values, and now all of a sudden I could attack different enemies. I wasn't even ready at this point to communicate with a database or read files in and parse the input from that. But that's okay because I was trying to scope down problems into something that I could work with, and over time I found different ways that I could go tackle those other problems. So instead of having 10,000 lines of code just because I wanted to attack different monsters, I could actually go load that information in from a database. And when I was finally ready to be able to have something where I could walk around and not just click a button, I actually figured out how to go create a very small game engine that was just a loop, and I could use other frameworks that existed. But by this point in time, I had already been programming for a while. So if you're getting stuck on your very first thing that you're trying to program and you're seeing all of these other people seemingly do it very fast, please don't get discouraged. Reflect on the things that we've been talking about in this video, right? So if you're trying to tackle too many things at once, whether that's more than one programming language or tech stack at the same time, that might be an issue. And maybe you want to scope it back because you're still trying to grasp some of the programming concepts that might be pretty basic and foundational. And until you have those in place, trying to layer on these other things just isn't going to register well for you. So what's the answer here? Should you be focusing on just one single language, or should you be able to tackle multiple at the same time? And like many things, unfortunately, it depends. But in this video, I hope that I offered up a little bit of perspective for you to consider when that might be applicable or when it might not be. Different things that you'll want to look out for yourself. So if you're considering using more than one, why you might want to be doing that, or when it might be a good time to dial it back and only focus on a single language and tech stack. And the other super important takeaway that I don't want you to forget is that everyone learns at a different pace, so please don't be discouraged. If you find that you're struggling, you can always try breaking the problem down into smaller, more digestible pieces, and that way you can make progress on those smaller pieces, and as you add them together, you really start seeing the progress come together. So I hope you found this valuable. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.